Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. The other day I did a Facebook Live video dedicated to my friend Andrew, who just died recently, who used to do all kinds of Facebook Live videos. Um, and the reason I started making these videos is consciousness of mortality and the awareness that I may I may die any day now. I have Crohn's disease, so I'm aware that that sometimes is fatal. And so I started making these videos for that reason, to really record these ideas about how stories work, because I thought I may never get a chance ever to teach creative writing as I dreamed of doing. Um, and so, but at the same time, my friend Andrew would make these Facebook Live videos about all of his thoughts and what have you. So that's why I made the Facebook Live video. And I wanted to transfer it to YouTube, but apparently I don't know how to do that because I'm not very smart with technology. So I want to just do that again. Just a basic coverage of the Rainbow Circle, everything the Rainbow Circle means. The Rainbow Circle is just a way of simplifying my concepts of how stories work. And I would get into these disagreements with people and try to explain, what they would say, what is your actual idea of how stories work? And I would say, it involves a lot of things. And so I came up with the Rainbow Circle just as a visual shorthand for that. First and foremost, it is a spectrum. It's a spectrum between seemingly opposite things. They're not actually opposite things. I think a lot of the flaws when it comes to people talking about writing stories or any sort of art is dualistic thinking, and not recognizing all of these different factors as resonating with each other in the spectrum. I broke it down to 7 different factors. Longtime fans of my friend the Rainbow Circle will be familiar with these, but I'm not sure at any point if I explain all of them really comprehensively. But basically, one of the brilliant and amazing things about the Rainbow Circle as a spectrum is that you can view it really 2 different ways when it comes to prioritization. If you're an artist, you would prioritize it this way. This is the most important thing. Everything else resonates from that, emanates from that. Emanation is a good way of thinking of it. Everything else emanates from that central Rainbow Circle. The center of the Rainbow Circle there. If you're a scholar, you certainly prioritize this way. So, if you think of it, the circle, this could be the top of the rainbow. This could be the top of the rainbow. Either one, you could prioritize either direction. But the center of the Rainbow Circle is the pure, irrational, visceral, emotional, empathetic response to an artistic text. And that's to a text or a visual piece or what have you. That's all it really needs to be. The only real requirement of a text, of an artistic piece, is that it's emotionally stimulating, viscerally stimulating. Other end of the spectrum, and it's non-dualistic. The other end of the spectrum is dualistic. This is where it kind of gets cognitively complicated to say. It's a spectrum between dualism and non-dualism that's kind of tricky to wrap your mind around, but that's basically how it works. This is more dualistic and hierarchical and destimulating. The rainbow spectrum, the Rainbow Circle spectrum, is pulling back and forth between these two different ends of the spectrum, towards destimulation and towards stimulation. So these 2 forces are sort of pulling against each other. So if you're creating an artistic piece, you're trying to optimize the stimulation. Since this is your priority, you're prioritizing this at the top. You're trying to optimize access to the stimulation of the core of the Rainbow Circle. Other parts of life, whatever the part of life you're looking at, you're trying to destimulate. So, the most basic example, if you think about sadness or fear or any sort of supposedly negative emotion, that's, very indicative of our culture, that we would call them negative emotions. Is sadness a bad thing necessarily? So if someone is feeling sadness, you have two responses. You have more than two responses, but let's say hypothetically you have two responses. One of them is that you could strive to solve the sadness. You view sadness as a thing to eliminate. So to destimulate, go to the destimulating end of the spectrum. That's an entirely valid response to sadness. There's no right or wrong. It's one entirely valid response to sadness. You could also feel the sadness along with the person and say, I feel what you are feeling. I recognize that and validate your sadness. I'm not going to dismiss your sadness as something that must always be eliminated. That's my personal preference in treatment of so-called negative emotions. But both responses are valid. And there's a spectrum between them. So, the last time I really talked to my friend Andrew, who is dead now, we were going to talk about comic books. My favorite comic book is Doctor Strange. His favorite comic book was Moon Knight. I don't really know as much about Moon Knight. Not nearly as much about Moon Knight as he knew. So I can't really speak too much on Moon Knight. But I'll use Doctor Strange as an example. So the most basic end of the spectrum when it comes to experiencing Doctor Strange, I'll use the movie as an example because I know I have thousands and thousands and millions of fans out there who are huge fans of me, but may not have read the actual comic books. May not have read the actual comic books. But you like to get in my face. All of my animals like to get into my face. There you go. I'll just lean over. You could stay on my lap, but just in my face. So I'm moving your head gently out of my way. But anyway, my millions and millions of fans may not have actually read the Doctor Strange comics, may have seen the movie. So I'll use the movie as an example. The movie was fine. I love Doctor Strange, so I'm going to be nitpicky about the movie version. But the movie version was fine. First and foremost, you have the visceral, irrational response to the center of the rainbow circle. So you would, he has this crash. It's very, very visceral. His hands are really messed up. He's clawing his way back up to, return to the life that he knew. He's very desperate and intensely emotional. But if it was just this intense emotion, if it was just somebody going through this crash and this physically difficult thing, that might cause the reader to short circuit. And that's something to always be conscious of in creating an art piece. There's a lot of perfectly valid art pieces that are much more purely visceral and intensely, body horror type of stuff. Totally valid, perfectly fine. But when it comes to most of his personality, it's very prickly, it's very arrogant, it's very off-putting. And that's where you get that second end of the spectrum, where you have his vulnerability matched with his arrogance and his effort to distance people from him and all that sort of stuff. So those two things really match together: his vulnerability and his arrogance, his prickly personality that distances people from him. That's a paradoxical level, and it functions really to temper that more purely visceral level in order to make it, in order to translate to the reader and short circuiting of the intensely vulnerable, irrational level. In any great character, you more than likely, if it's great character, more than likely you'll see some of that paradox, the direct contradiction between, let's say, motivations, or direct contradiction between something that the character desires, but also desires the complete opposite. So Doctor Strange makes himself vulnerable in order to eliminate his vulnerability. He supplicates himself before the Ancient One in order to eliminate this vulnerability. He humbles himself in order to eliminate this thing that has been humbling him. So that sort of paradox makes him a really compelling character. one of the most practical, and I mean, this is hopefully designed for a practical thing you can use to create a story as well. So, one of the most practical things in creating a character is that paradoxical level. Recognizing what really motivates a character, but also what is the direct opposite motivation that creates a lot of that stimulation. And I've talked a lot about how much I abhor the iceberg. That's a much better way of thinking of the iceberg. Exponentially better way of thinking of the iceberg. The subtext is pulling dynamically against the text in order to create this dynamic. The dogs are going to knock over the rainbow circle. Everybody just always wants to knock over my poor rainbow circle. Don't knock over my rainbow circle, please. Okay, everybody settle down. You're not on camera right now, so you don't need to show out. Just settle down and sit down. There you go. Okay. So, do you think I'm talking to you? Probably do. You don't understand what's happening. You sort of blend in with the background. So what was I saying? Yes, the paradoxical level is number 2. Great rich area to create characters out of, especially. Level 3 is the schematic level. That's the one, arguably that's the one, these 2 levels are really what you should be talking about most when it comes to actually creating a story. By far the most significant and potent ones to really deal with in actual creation of a story. And most art forms, you could probably get away with just level 1 and level 2. Level 3, you'll certainly have that in some art forms. So you could look at, like, music could be much more purely visceral, but it has a basic form. Doesn't have to, but it has a basic form. You can look at an art piece, like an abstract expressionist art piece. It's much more purely visceral. Doesn't have a form. I mean, arguably, you could say it does. For a story to be a story kind of needs a bit of that internal order system. There's no absolute guarantee of what the order system needs to be, but it's sort of a step towards going from that purely visceral, irrational, chaotic center. It's a step towards the more orderly sort of story structure that you might have. But it's just an internal rule system. It doesn't necessarily have any necessary reflection with anything outside of the story. Commonly, it reflects quote-unquote reality. It doesn't have to, though. That's the key. And that could take all kinds of different forms. So it could take, like, the Doctor Strange movie as a movie. Those tend to be much more self-contained. They have a beginning, middle, and end. They have a definite arc. So, Doctor Strange has this definite arc. Has these different acts that follow the pattern of previous movies. One of the valid criticisms was that structurally it was very similar to the Iron Man movie. They were both origin movies. Stan Lee, as much as I love his writing, one of my heroes as a writer, his Doctor Strange was writing on Doctor Strange was magnificent, but when it came to origins, he went to the well a lot. I mean, he was creating all of these 20, 30, 40 characters who are still continuously serialized today. He was writing, 10 comics at once or whatever. Most comic book writers, they'll do maybe 2 or 3. Bendis might do 5 or 6 or 7, but he was writing so many comics at once, he kind of just went to the well a lot with the origin stories. So yeah, I mean, the story is kind of similar. The structure is kind of similar. There's a fall from grace. There's an attempt to rise again. There's the discovery of a new power. That sort of thing. Fairly similar sort of structure. So it could be basic story structure. It could be things like genre. And Doctor Strange, I mean, these are superhero stories. It follows some of the basic structure of a superhero story. Arguably, Doctor Strange is not really a superhero. That's a classic argument going way, way back. But yeah, I mean, to a degree, he certainly follows that basic structure of the superhero story. Commonly, a lot of Doctor Strange stories will be horror stories, or they'll be detective stories. Like one of my favorites is there's a whole series of stories with the character Nightmare, who might be the main character of the next Doctor Strange movie, Doctor Strange 2. Okay, there you go. The Multiverse of Madness, I think is what it's called. So there's a good chance Nightmare will be the story. Doctor Strange will have this investigation. He'll find out it's Nightmare. He'll go into the Nightmare world. He'll battle Nightmare. But it starts off basically as a detective story or a mystery story. But your basic structure there is that you have a homeostasis. Everything is peaceful and homeostatic. It's there's not any sort of stimulation going on. There's some sort of menace that creates the stimulation, or there's some sort of irrational uncertainty that creates the stimulation. The hero of order, let's say, hypothetically, comes in and disrupts that. Or tries to eliminate the disruption of the homeostasis, returns the homeostasis, and the story ends. So one of the basic schematic mistakes or errors that people make in understanding basic story schema, basic story structure, is to mistake the end of the story for the purpose of the story. So, the hero of order returns the homeostasis. And so the claim that you'll hear is that the purpose of the story is to champion that homeostasis or champion order. But once you return the homeostasis, you don't have order anymore. You don't have a story anymore. You have order. Once you have order, you don't have a story anymore. So that's not the purpose of the story. That's the end of the story. You no longer have a story once you achieve that homeostasis. All you have is just denouement, just a little bit of story, wrapping up of a story left. You can't really sustain a story without that disruption of homeostasis, arguably. So the end of the story is not the purpose of the story. That's one of my mantras. But anyway, you have a whole wide variety of different ways to consider schema. You can consider it in terms of genre, story structure, all kinds of different things. You can look at the disruption of schema. So you could say, in what ways does Doctor Strange disrupt the story expectations? That's one of the real practical ways to really use the schema, is talking about story expectations. What are the story expectations of a superhero story? If the story fulfills those expectations, what sort of comfort does that bring to the reader or the viewer? If the story disrupts those expectations, what sort of discomfort does it bring? Can it enhance stimulation, or can it short circuit the access of the reader to that, and they just reject the story completely? Both are really possible. So it's hard to make a rule based on that. There's no real rule for a genre. It's just, what are the effects of recognition of what seems to be a rule? What are the effects of breaking what seems to be a rule? What are the effects of fulfilling what seems to be a rule? One of the ways of thinking of the spectrum is to say, this is the realm of discomfort, this is the realm of comfort. You're striving for comfort and you're striving for discomfort, and those are pulling against each other. And schema can be comfortable fulfilling expectations. Schematic expectations can be comfortable. Disrupting the schematic expectations can be stimulating, or it can lead to a reader to reject a story. And all of this is very, very subjective. So, one thing that can bring comfort is, and one thing can bring comfort to a particular person, and one thing can bring increased stimulation to a different person. There's no way to really make a universal out of it, arguably. After that, you have with schema, there's a relationship to reality. Reality is this level, the red level right here. The bridge between them, I call it the psychological level. And the psychological level is really, I don't know if that's really the best word for it, but I'm looking for a better name one of these days. But psychological level is just a level of emanations and reflection. So where you have those internal levels of stimulation and what have you. How does that reflect the inside and the outside of a character. How does that reflect in the reader outside of the text? How do all those different things emanate in each other? So you might look at this is kind of where the complexities of metaphors come in. A lot of people oversimplify metaphors. What people call metaphors are actually a wide variety of different things. So if you look at Doctor Strange, he goes through this traumatic situation. How does the external world reflect the trauma that he went through? So how do these demonic forces that he battles reflect his inner demons? And you can think of that. You can think of that metaphorically, reflecting some abstraction, some cerebral abstraction. You can think of that as a resonance inside of the character. This is why it's important. Here's a couple of different principles to keep in mind. There are two types of abstraction. Let me cover that. The two types of abstraction. There's abstraction down internally, the visceral abstraction. So something like abstract expressionism is expressing something emotional. It's breaking down the stimulation of an artistic piece to its purest form in interactions of color and that sort of thing. And that's abstraction, but it's not the same sort of abstraction as a math problem, for example. Does a math problem bring you emotional stimulation? Well, no, not really. That's more what I would call cerebral abstraction. And that's abstraction up this direction. So the animals are causing chaos off screen. Maggie and Siku, just calm down. Everybody just calm down. Hey, Siku. Okay. Alright, so cerebral abstraction is up here. Visceral abstraction is down here. So the psychological level is, resonates all these different levels. So if, let's say, a real basic example would be, what are you doing back there? How about you just not move? Is it possible just to not constantly move while I'm doing this? All you guys were asleep just a second ago. You were just snoring away. As soon as I started doing this, you just have to explore everywhere. So anyway, so the trauma that he goes through in his car crash manifests inside of the character, but also manifests externally with the character. How do those two different parts really reflect each other? The example I always use is Alice. Alice has this waking world and this dreaming world. How do things in the waking world reflect the dreaming world? Her waking world is still fictional. I have an Alice magnet right over here. Her waking world is still fictional, but it's still reflecting on this other layer inside of her dream. So that level is really looking at how all these different parts of the... What are you doing? How about stop? How about you just stop? Just stop. Everybody stop. Stop. Okay, sit down. Can you just sit down? Everybody just calm down. All of the animals. I have 4 mammals in this room right now. And they're all just looking around like they've never been in this room before. Anyway. You've been in this room plenty. Don't act like you haven't. They're about to knock over this easel just because they're smelling everything. Okay, stop. Everybody just stop. Everybody. Jacob, stop. That's not something for you. It's just a bag. Okay. Where was I? So, a really basic interpretation of his trauma from his accident is it manifests as these, as Dormammu, as these demonic forces, but it, reflects viscerally on the visceral abstraction level. That was my main point. The psychological level is the sort of where that resonance happens. The barrier level. It's the one right in the middle, so it's the barrier level. Then you have realism and one of the reasons I created the Rainbow Circle is because I was taught really poorly in my creative writing education. Everything that people told me was wrong. But one of the concepts that people kept coming back to was how realism is the most pure level, and realism is the only thing that's really important, and everything should be realistic. If it's not realistic, it must be a metaphor for realism, or it must be represent realism in some way, which is nonsense. Most of the time, schematically, it manifests as realistic. So if a story starts off realistically, and if it violates this realism in some way, there is certainly an effect of that where it could be stimulating, like magical realism or something like that. It could be stimulating in and of itself. What are you hoping to accomplish right now? Yes, I know. Why don't you sit down and just stop? Sit. I taught you sit. Just sit. There you go. Okay. You are on camera right now. Okay. So realism, so if a story starts realistically, then it violates that realism. It can be off-putting to a reader. It can seem like it's something bad, not universally. One of the basic principles, I haven't talked about post-rationalization. Really the only explanation of why that you really need of why a particular story is good or bad is really just a purely subjective, visceral response to something that's irrational. I irrationally liked it, or I irrationally disliked it. A lot of the times we come up with these post-rationalizations to explain why we liked it or disliked it. So, for example, I disliked it because it's not realistic. That is a post-rationalization. That's not really a universal reason why something would be bad. Not being realistic eliminates just not being realistic. Can you just why don't you just come around? Come here. Just get out of there. Okay, come here. You can get on my lap. Get on my lap. Just get on my lap. You'll be calm on my lap. There you go. Okay. Hold on. I didn't mean everybody get on my lap. Okay, if you can't see me, I'm behind all of these dogs. I just wanted you to stop moving on top of the stuff, making all that noise. I didn't mean for you to lick your face. Okay. If you can see me out there in television land, what was I saying? So just being unrealistic, it's not really a universal reason why something's bad. What you're saying, why are you barking at me right now? You're just barking right in my face. I see you. I love you. I'm giving you attention. I have to give attention to other things too. It can't be just every single second. You're the only thing I pay attention to. You can't just bark at me and growl at me. Okay. Do I just need to wait for you to just get done with this? Are you done? Thank you. Stop. What are you going to accomplish doing that? You need to stop. Everybody just stop. Okay. Everybody just stop. Do I need to kick you out? Do I need to kick you out? I'm not opposed to that. Okay, so anyway, this would go much quicker if the doggies could calm down. Okay, stop. Where was I? Oh yes, realism is a factor. It's a lower level emanation. A story is not going to be reality. It's reflecting reality. It's representing reality. It's not really reality. A much more pure level is just direct transmission of emotional experience. And that's what you're actually responding to. Not that it's realistic, but that it's transmitting these emotional experiences. That's my point. I'll just leave it at that. But I would, I have had plenty of people use the bludgeon of reality against me irrationally. It doesn't actually mean anything. The orange level right here is the universal. So something that's treated as universal And that's where, you have things like the human condition, hold that whole idea. Um, when that's treated as your base level uh, analysis of a text, it leads to the deeply um, uh, uh, the deeply inefficient interpretation, this whole human condition concept, that the reason I like a character is because he stands in for all of humanity. So um, the reason I like Doctor Strange, for example, is that he goes through this experience that stands in for the experience of all of humanity. So it's going from character or writer, Stan Lee, whoever, to viewer, reader, me. It's making that transit, I would say, a much simpler sort of transit, much purer, more practical, more effective, more accurate sort of transit is just the pure visceral transmission of that emotional energy. Whereas that whole human condition concept is that it goes from Stan Lee, it makes the transition through the entirety of humanity, throughout the history of existence. All human beings have experienced this thing. And because all human beings have experienced this thing, I also find empathy with the character because all human beings have experienced that. It's a ridiculously inefficient concept. It's like I have Douglas Adams sitting right here. It's like the infinite improbability drive. I have my Douglas Adams sitting right here. It's like the infinite probability drive, or whatever it's called. I can't remember exactly. Where you travel to this distant place by traveling through all places first, all other places first. It's kind of a ridiculously inefficient concept. However, you can still, it's still valid from a scholarly perspective to start up here and say, here is what's true in all cases. It's look at something syllogistically. That's entirely fine. Here's something that's true in all cases. Here's how this thing that's true in all cases applies to this specific text. That's not an explanation for why we enjoy a particular art piece or a particular story. That's the inverse. It's explaining this sociological condition. So the example that I use examples all the time in my classes. So examples might be we talk about Wizard of Oz and Mad Woman in the Attic. What they do in Mad Woman in the Attic is they say, here is the pattern commonly that you see with female characters written by male writers, and this represents this tendency in a society of men generally to try to reduce the power of women by creating these characters who have very little power. And so, in the Doctor Strange movie, that character, Rachel McAdams' character, really functions to highlight something about the male character. She's just a cog in the machine. She doesn't really have any sort of humanity. So here's this universal concept. Here's how female characters are presented in texts. Here's a specific example of a female character. This represents how male writers are depowering female characters. My favorite Doctor Strange character is Clea, who started off as this very Mad Woman in the Attic sort of character, grew into this very powerful queen and what have you. And I wish that she had been in the movie. I wish that they would have Clea as a character, because she's this fascinating, complicated, very human. She's Faltinian. Just to be very nerdy, she's Faltinian, but she's this very complicated, very human sort of a character with all kinds of complexities and vulnerabilities, and but also at the same time very, very powerful, very smart, more powerful than Doctor Strange at times, for sure. She was able to defeat Umar. She was able to defeat 2 Degree, Dormammu, all that sort of stuff. So anyway, but from the bottom up, as a writer, I would say first she needs to be very human, and have all of these emotional, visceral resonances as this very human character. and then everything else would emanate from that. But as a scholar, looking at it, I would say, first, we need to recognize this problem in society. Here's an example of this problem in society, and what have you. And then you move on to the next level, which is the rhetorical. Here's what we should do about this problem in society. So, perfectly valid perspective. I wouldn't start with that in creating a character, because, ironically, that's a way of dehumanizing a character if they just stand in for this supposedly universal concept. So, yeah. I think that's it. Thank you for joining us today. When I did this on Facebook, it took about an hour. Even with all the animal interruptions, that only took about 35 minutes. But at least it's recorded. So if I die, find this video so that you know my belief systems. Like Ferdinand de Saussure, tell the children this is how stories work. See you on the next episode.